I'm Morgyn Wood, and here's your 8-minute and 46-second recap of Week 2 of Seeking Justice for George Floyd, the Derek Chauvin Trial. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is on trial for the death of George Floyd after kneeling on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. The incident happened on May 25th, 2020, outside of Cup Foods at the intersection of East 38th and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis. The second week of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin is in the books, and just before proceedings began on Monday, April 5th, Judge Peter Cahill held a private hearing to determine if there was any juror misconduct, and he found that there was none.
The court makes the finding that there was no juror misconduct and that the jurors were credible in their responses, and accordingly, no action will be taken.
Testimony for the day started with Dr. Bradford Wonkeat Langfield, the attending physician at the hospital who treated George Floyd when he arrived. He indicated in his testimony that George Floyd was in critical condition from cardiac arrest when he came in, and determined that Floyd likely died because he was deprived of oxygen.
Was your leading theory then for the cause of Mr. Floyd's cardiac arrest oxygen deficiency?
That was one of the more likely possibilities. I felt that at the time, based on the information I had, it was more likely than the other possibilities.
And doctor, is there another name for death by oxygen deficiency?
Asphyxia.
Then the court heard testimony from MPD Police Chief Madeira Arredondo, who ultimately fired Derek Chauvin. He testified about police policies and the use of force, adding that Chauvin's use of force was unnecessary.
Do you believe that the defendant followed departmental policy 5-304 regarding de-escalation?
I absolutely do not agree with that.
And how so?
That action is not de-escalation.
MPD officer Katie Blackwell also took the witness stand. She's responsible for training other officers in the field, and she chose Chauvin to be a field training officer.
Is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
And why not?
Well, use of force according to policy has to be, consistent with MPD training, and what we train are neck restraints, the conscious and unconscious neck restraint.
On Tuesday, proceedings started with testimony from Minneapolis Police Officer Kerr Yang. He is the crisis intervention officer for the Minneapolis Police Department. He testified about crisis intervention policies in place at MPD, the critical decision-making model officers are encouraged to use, and crisis de-escalation.
The policy requires that when it's safe and feasible, that we shall de-escalate.
Then MPD Lieutenant Johnny Murrell took the witness stand. He provides use of force training to Minneapolis police officers. He also testified on the use of force and neck restraints. He said you want to use the least amount of force necessary to meet your objectives. Murrell indicated that based on training and police policies, Chauvin's actions were not authorized.
And if the subject is offering no resistance, obviously, then no neck restraint would be authorized.
That's correct.
Then the court heard testimony from Nicole McKenzie, a 6-year vet with MPD and the medical support coordinator. She trains recruits, cadets, and officers in first aid, CPR, and the administering of Narcan, the drug used to reverse opioid overdoses. She indicated in her testimony that if someone is speaking, that does not mean they are necessarily breathing well.
There is a possibility that somebody could be in respiratory distress and still being able to verbalize it. Just because they're speaking doesn't mean they're breathing adequately.
The last witness of the day was LAPD Sgt Jody Steger. He was brought in by the state as an expert witness. Testimony resumed on Wednesday with Steger on the stand. He said after reviewing police policies and the evidence presented in this case that Chauvin's use of force against George Floyd was excessive.
And based upon your review of these materials and in light of the Graham factors, what is your opinion as to the degree of force used by the defendant on Mr. Floyd on the date in question?
My opinion was that the force was excessive.
Steger also indicated in his testimony that the crowd outside of Cup Foods at the scene was not an adequate distraction for Derek Chauvin to be neglectful to George Floyd's medical needs.
It would be possible for a loud group, to distract a defendant from being attentive to George Floyd. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you believe that occurred?
No, I do not.
Why is that?
Because in the body-worn video, you can hear Mr. Floyd displaying his discomfort and pain, and you can also hear the defendant responding to him.
Then the court heard testimony from James D. Ryerson, a senior special agent of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. He was responsible for collecting evidence from the scene, including the two involved officer vehicles, as well as video footage from Cup Foods and the Dragon Walk restaurant across the street from Cup Foods. In his testimony, he admitted to the court that he could hear George Floyd saying he ate too many drugs in one of the videos.
Did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
Did it appear that Mr. Floyd said, "I ate too many drugs"?
Yes, it did.
Ryerson later amended that statement and indicated that he thought George Floyd actually said, "I ain't do no drugs." The court then heard testimony from Mackenzie Anderson from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, a forensic scientist who processed and analyzed various evidence in the case. And the last witness to take the stand on Wednesday evening was Susan Neath, a forensic chemist, who also analyzed various evidence in the case. On Thursday, proceedings started with the state bringing in expert medical witnesses to testify. First on the witness stand was Dr. Martin Tobin, a pulmonologist, which is a doctor who specializes in respiratory systems or breathing as we know it. He indicated in his testimony that based on his analysis and the reviewed video of the incident, George Floyd died from low level of oxygen.
Mr. Floyd died from a low level of oxygen, and this caused damage to his brain that we see, and it also caused a PEA arrhythmia that caused his heart to stop.
He said George Floyd being handcuffed on the street in the prone position with a knee on his back at one point and a knee on his neck were all factors in his breathing. The court also heard testimony from Dr. Daniel Schmidt. He's a forensic toxicologist from the National Medical Services Labs. He testified that George Floyd likely died of low oxygen, despite there being various levels of different substances in George Floyd's body.
Mr. Floyd died from positional asphyxia, which is a fancy way of saying he died because he had no oxygen left in his body.
And Thursday's testimony wrapped up with Dr. Bill Smock, an ER specialist with a concentration in forensic medicine. Then on Friday, proceedings started with testimony from Dr. Lindsey Thomas, the former assistant medical examiner who ruled George Floyd's death a homicide. In her testimony, she indicated that George Floyd likely died because he didn't have enough oxygen, directly related to the actions of the police officers.
The activities of the law enforcement officers resulted in Mr. Floyd's death, and that specifically those activities were the subdual, the restraint, and the neck compression.
Then the jury heard testimony from Dr. Andrew Baker, the chief medical examiner. He testified that he chose not to look at any videos before conducting George Floyd's autopsy to avoid any bias.
Had you seen any of the videos at the time you started your work?
I had not. I was aware that at least one video had gone viral on the internet, but I intentionally chose not to look at that until I had examined Mr. Floyd. I did not want to bias my exam by going in with any preconceived notions that might lead me down one pathway or another.
And that's your 8-minute and 46-second Week 2 recap of Seeking Justice for George Floyd, the Derek Chauvin Trial. I'm Morgyn Wood on the Black Information Network.